This episode with Ian Watson gets right to the heart of why myth and archetypes are still, and in fact, especially relevant in today's modern world. I had a conversation with a friend at the weekend, and we were eating pomegranate salad. And we got talking about the relationship between the pomegranate, the underworld. I was telling them about the Persephone myth. And I realize more clearly than I have in a long time how we culturally have really lost touch with the power of myth. And the reason is we see it as this irrelevance. We see it as my friend was saying, isn't it just a made up story? Or at most, isn't it just an analogy? This episode really gets into the heart of the relevance of myth to our own journey of knowing ourselves, to making contact with our own soul. Let's dive in. Hello, Ian. I was about to say welcome to the show. It's actually welcome back to the show after many years.
A good few years. Yeah, lovely to be back here with you, Lian. Thank you.
Mm. And what a topic for I know this is one that's so close to both of our hearts, and we met at our mutual friend Elizabeth's Christmas party last month, and we're kind of already starting to dive into all things Jung and myth and symbols, so it feels like a bit a continuation of that conversation too.
Yeah, and it's a treat for me to have these kind of conversations because they're not probably the everyday conversations that we have with everyone, but I think when you find someone who has that mutual understanding, it helps to bring it to life, doesn't it?
It really does. Yes, I often think that I think partly um the that world of myth, and really even that worldview of myth, I think is something that has become rare in this modern world. I think it's absolutely natural for humans and is our, really connected to our original worldview, but these days it's not that common. So, and I think there is something really really wonderful and rich when we do have other people to journey into this way of being with. So yeah, like you, when I find someone else, I'm like, oh, let's dive deeper. So let's start with just a bit of kind of origin story in terms of how did you come to have the love of myth that you have?
Well, I think the main credit goes to Joseph Campbell, really,
Hmm.
who I discovered in my early 20s. He'd recorded, uh, I think the year before he died, a series of wonderful conversations with Bill Moyers, which went out, and it was a series called The Power of Myth. And I remember watching this for the first time and being completely blown away. But it also, I mean, it not only kind of opened that door for me, which has just continued to open ever since, but what it also did was help me to make, already at that age, to make sense of some things from my earlier life, or at least to begin to start to make sense of some of those things.
Mm.
I started to see how he wasn't just talking about historical events. I mean, he was talking about historical events very often, mythic tales go back a long, long way, but he was talking about them in a way that made them relevant to my life. And I could see that that was powerful. You know, I could feel the effect of that. And just to give you an example, when I was 8 years old, I had an experience of being out in nature, which I spent a lot of time out in nature as a youngster, all my free time and holidays. And whenever I wasn't in school, I was basically out in the woods or walking up on the moorlands in Yorkshire where I grew up. That was my natural habitat. And I had an experience one day. It was a beautiful summer's day, and I was with my friends. I'd lost track of them momentarily, and I found myself in this long, long grass, which was pretty much as tall as I was. And for reasons unknown, everything suddenly changed, and the grass became kind of golden, as if it was illuminated from the inside. At first, I thought it was just the patch that was in front of me. And then I realized everywhere I looked, it was the same. It was kind of lit up from within, as if it was glowing. And I was like, whoa. And what I
Mm.
experienced then was there was a kind of dissolving of my sense of being separate from the grass and from everything else. And yet I was fully conscious and fully aware. So it just felt like I just started to spread out across the landscape. And I realized there were no edges. There wasn't a place where I stopped and it began, and or vice versa. And it was the most beautiful experience. And uh, I don't know how it happened or why it happened at that particular moment. I don't know how long it lasted. It was probably a matter of a minute or two, something like that. And then it gradually drifted away, and I found myself back in this normal world of grass and moorland and everything else. Went to find my friends and was struggling to know whether to tell them or what to tell them, and I didn't actually
Mm.
tell them anything. I didn't mention this to anyone for a long time, but when I heard Joseph Campbell speaking, that experience suddenly came back to mind, and I started to realize that I'm not the only one who had that
Mm.
kind of an experience. And in fact, there's all kinds of other experiences that I think I'd had, and many of us have, which we're prone to dismiss, or we feel like we can't really share them because we can't make sense of them. And yet the mythic understanding started to make sense of them, for me at least. So
Mm.
that was one connection that I made straight away. And as a boy, also, I remember watching things like Jason and the Argonauts, on a movie, and just like that story was just so powerful and so amazing. And again, when I studied Campbell, it's the classic hero's journey myth right there, which he laid out so
Mm.
beautifully in his first book. And just recognizing that those themes are themes which are actually alive in all of us. And that's just an interest that, yeah, it was awoken, I suppose, at a relatively early age, but it stayed with me ever since.
Mm. I love that so much. And what's occurring to me is how I think because it's such a natural worldview for humans, my sense is it's actually something that we are trained out of, conditioned out of.
Yeah.
And then some of us are fortunate enough to either have that not trained out of us so early or have it awoken. And and then again, sometimes, like for me personally, I was raised in a way of being that was just so steeped in myth and magic and archetypes. My father was just, so deep into that way of being. So I've often, this is more of like a symbolic explanation, but in itself, it's powerful. I learned my left and right from two tarot cards, the high priestess on the left and the magician on the right, painted floor to ceiling in our sitting room. Um, and because that was the way I learned my left and right, I'd conjure them to mind every time I try and like which is my left, which is my right. I'd have to bring them to mind, and so that serves as an example of like the kind of upbringing I had. We also played Dungeons and Dragons, which of course is just like really inviting you to be immersed in that reality. That
Yeah.
reality of fantasy and myths and these just again these archetypes that really allow us to start to see these threads that have been with us for as long as humans have probably been on the planet. So I very much was raised with that worldview. And then it was later on for me, like for often it will be for most children, I think it will be parents that first and foremost start to condition children out of thinking that way. For me, it didn't come until quite a bit later. But then I think in some ways it was all the more harsh and painful as a result. It was like suddenly this realization of, oh, this isn't how most people think. This isn't how most people live. I need to get rid of this. I need to leave this behind. And it didn't occur to me until the other day how I'd gone so far in that direction that I remember if I used to come across someone talking using the symbols of myths, for example, I would almost feel like they were just being a bit like grandiose, like as in like how boring, like none of that means anything. You're just rabbiting on about, whatever this represents this, and it's come from this Greek myth, and I'm like, who cares? Like, what does that like? I had this really distinct memory of at some point in my kind of early adulthood really relating to. I remember I was gifted the amazing book Women Who Run with the Wolves when I was about sort of 21. And by that point, that transition out of the mythical worldview had already happened. And I just couldn't get anything from it. I remember flicking through it just like, this just means nothing. Like, why on earth would I read these stupid fairy tales? Like, how can they have anything in them? And like now, I just think, oh my god! I mean, I think it's a useful experience to have had because I can now relate to why myth can be so opaque for people. But as I started to come back to this worldview, this way of being, now it's actually hard for me to remember that. It's just like, for me now the symbols are so, you talked about the way the grass around you is illuminated, like more and more that's how these symbols of myth appear to me. It's like these portals that open up and invite you to go deeper.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I suppose I mean my uh, home life was very much more conventional, the conventional life of the type you described, where myth wasn't considered really, it wasn't part of our family life or conversation. So for me, it became a kind of secret hobby
Hmm.
for a time. But I think I was fortunate because once I kind of found my path and my journey was into the healing arts, and my first interest really there was through discovering that plants and trees were actually medicines. I
Hmm.
don't remember the exact moment I discovered that, but I remember it was quite pivotal because I'd spent so long already in nature, in the woodlands, looking at the hedgerows and so on. And then all of a sudden I had different eyes because I was looking at them now thinking, what can this one do? And what's this one being used for? And is this poisonous or not poisonous? Is this medicinal or and that whole world started to open up. And then when I studied homeopathy, which became the main focus for the next sort of 15, 20 years for me, I discovered that in homeopathy, there are remedies which are used which have kind of archetypal images
Hmm.
associated with them. So when homeopath talks about a remedy, it's like they're describing a certain character, a certain person, sometimes a certain body type, and all of these things you can recognize in your life. So that I started to see that was also bringing that back, to life for me and giving it more depth and more richness. So I think I was quite fortunate in that I found a kind of interest and career path where I could just keep exploring that dimension more and more, pretty much on my own initially, but
Hmm.
then with colleagues and peers.
Yes, I was just recalling that your background's in homeopathy, and one of our past students, Nicole Barton, who I know that you're friends with too, um, I didn't know anything really about homeopathy until we started working with her. And then immediately I was like, oh, wow, these are archetypes too. And
Yeah.
there's also this, from my own, because my own kind of way of looking at things is both archetypal but also shamanic. I was really seeing the way that those themes of kind of looking at working with really the kind of, you could say, the spirits or the energies of these plants, these beings in that way, but then also the way that they have these archetypal patterns. I was like, of course. And I think more and more when I look at things that work, that have some efficacy, they almost always do have these types of symbols woven in, these type of energies woven in. I just see that over and over now.
Yeah, me too. Me too. And at a certain point you start to see how they all interconnect also.
Mm,
You know,
yes, yes,
because
yes.
for me, I remember when I committed myself to homeopathy as a path, the other big interest that I'd already developed was astrology. And I
Hmm.
literally felt myself to be at some kind of a crossroads, which one am I going to really study in depth? It felt like an either or decision, and I chose homeopathy as the primary interest, but astrology was already there in the background for me. And then many years later, I had a homeopathy teacher and colleague, and he'd spent years seeing how those two things actually fit together beautifully.
Oh, wow.
And going
Mm.
back, in ancient times, there was even before we had telescopes and so on, there was a recognition that there are these moving bodies in the sky, which, known as the planets, which included the sun and moon, which corresponds to the 7 days of the week. So each of the 7 days of the week is named after one of those. You got Sundays, obviously. Monday is Moon Day today. Tuesday is Mars. Wednesday is Mercury. Thursday is Jupiter. Friday is Venus. And then back around to Saturday. And so there's a whole system was created based on the day of the week that a person was born on. It was considered that that particular planetary energy would be represented in in their character, in their body type, and so on. And also the hour of birth would give a bit more specificity to it. And then each of these planetary influences was also connected to organs in the body. So the sun rules the heart, the moon rules the brain, and also the uterus and the female organs, on and on like this. And then you've got correspond with particular metals. Every planet has got a metal, like the sun is gold, the moon is silver, Saturn is lead, and so forth. And the herbs, they also correspond. And you start to see, oh my God, it's all one system.
Mm.
And that to me was when it really started to come to life, when recognizing that it doesn't really matter what your entry point is. If you go into it deeply enough, you'll start to see how it connects to everything else.
Oh my goodness. Yes, I couldn't agree more. Funny enough, I was really into astrology as a child and then again kind of pushed it away for years, and then in the last year I've been really called back to it. And this year was meant to be the year that I went sort of deeper into astrology, and then suddenly left field I got called to go back deeper into tarot. But of course they're so interlinked. I can see that, oh, it's just a detour to then, weave back into the understanding of astrology and talking about the way these symbols interlink. I've had this book for many years, but I'm diving back into it. It's the infamous Aleister Crowley,
Ah, yeah.
and it. I mean, it's literally tables upon tables of all the ways different symbols interlink. Like just like you're saying, for example, this is just a random page. Oh, you obviously won't be able to see the detail. You can see like it's pages and pages of these like correspondence tables, where like diamond, almond in flower, God. These are all the different correspondence with like that first thing. It's like all the way through the book, and the there's obviously a way that we could kind of think, oh, I need to memorize all this. But for me, the way into all of this is like if I can't feel some resonance, if I can't feel some like call to journey into it, I just leave it.
Me too.
What I've really noticed that these are alive energies, live, however you want to name them, spirits, energies, myths, archetypes. And the more we open to being in relationship to them, the less we need to kind of like remember them. Like, this isn't a kind of like, can I remember the theory? It's just like we get immersed into the embodiment of these things in a way that, again, if I'd gone back and spoken to my 20-year-old self, she'd just like, that's nonsense. But
Yeah.
hey,
Yes.
it's the realest thing I know.
No, I think that's a really important point, Leanne, is that there is this mysterious kind of timing element. And if we're not receptive, it literally doesn't speak to us.
Mm,
We can have a best friend who's like so passionate about this thing and is so enthusiastic, and we can pretend to be interested, but we either are or we're not. And
yes.
if it doesn't resonate for us at a particular moment, you're right, it doesn't activate that energy within oneself. So, and that to me is very much part of the function, or if you like, the purpose of having a mythical awareness, is that it opens your eyes to what's resonant for you in your life at
Mm,
that stage in your life, and recognizing that it will change as you grow and evolve. Certain things will fall away, or sometimes they cycle around, you come back to them, but something else is just is it the seed opening stage? It's just beginning to open up for you. And it looks to me
mm,
like those things are always in our world, they're always in our environment. The only variable is, are we open to it? Do we have the
yes.
receptivity to recognize it or not?
And to really again, in a world that doesn't value these things, it really requires something of us to value them, to honor
Yeah,
them, to think it's, this is the most important thing. I recorded a video earlier just giving a bit of a kind of how to work with dreams. And it really occurs to me, because I'm now so deep into this way of being. For me, it's so natural that we would honor, for example, things like the symbols rising our dreams. But as I'm recording something that's intended to go out to the general public, I recognise like how hard that is for many people to actually take these things seriously,
yeah,
to devote time and energy to them. But that's required. There's that, as you say, that openness to even notice where we're being called, but to actually honor that, to prioritize it, is a whole thing that I've seen is one of the biggest challenges for people, again, that have been sort of steeped in this modern cultural way of being, and this kind of like go, 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 productive, productive, conscious daylight world only, just to honor this. Again, we could say, the mythic in itself, I think, is one of the biggest, most important choices we can make, but one that we'll have to make over and over.
yeah. And that's obviously a reflection of our largely secular worldview at the moment. And
Mm,
science really is, we've relegated so much to the realm of science that used to
mm.
be part of the mythical realm. But I I don't know if you've come across the work of Martin Shaw,
Yes, yeah, amazing.
who I love. He's from
Oh.
Devon, and he's known as an oral storyteller. He keeps alive the oral storytelling tradition. Um, One of the things that I heard him say in one of his talks, he says, most of us, we have to be troubled into a deeper communication with our own soul and
Mm,
with our own depths. We have to be troubled into it, meaning that we don't go there voluntarily.
yes. Mm,
So life tends to
mm,
intervene with something that often will look like a catastrophe, or, something that we didn't
mm,
think that we were inviting into our life, whether it's sickness or loss, or something happens basically that disrupts the everyday continuity of our life, and that is the kind of opening to the mythic dimension. And obviously,
mm.
even at that point, we can still keep the blinkers on and only try to deal with it on a practical material level. But what he's pointing out is that we're being given these invitations all the time, but we still got to say yes to the adventure.
Yes, yes, we do. We do. It's funny, this is so synchronistic with a conversation I was having with my husband earlier. We were talking about the way that when we have these big life changes, how there's going to be a very natural, almost like wanting it to be over, to be back to normal life.
Yeah,
Even if we realize we can't go back to what was, at least like the next thing to be made available now. And I was saying it's completely understandable, particularly in a culture that really values that kind of continuity and functioning and everything being the same. But it's these opportunities where known life has been ruptured, has been taken away from us. We really get the opportunity to like know ourselves, to journey deeper into who we are. And
yeah,
again, that in itself, as you say, is that invitation into that mythical worldview. And I think it's something that can sound fantastical, like there's bills to pay, there's this to do, there's this to like, how can I just dwell in this like fantasy? And yet, it's like if we don't, we're going to get to this. It might sound dramatic, but this is what I was really brought present to in this conversation I had with him this morning. It's like we're going to get to the end of our life and not have actually done the thing that I believe we're here to do, which is to know ourselves.
yeah. Wow, yeah, that's so true. And I feel that more and more as I get older. I feel recently I was quite ill in November. I had a bronchitis, and it just really laid me in bed basically for a period of weeks. I hadn't been that ill for a long, long time, and I was noticing how my relationship to being sick has changed. over the years. I
Mm.
mean, it's always been a bit quirky, given that I tend not to go to the route of doctors and painkillers and things like that, just because of my interest and lifelong work in the holistic field. That's my go-to place anyway, which is already weird to a lot of people, but that to me is normal. But what I noticed this time also was that I really saw it as an opportunity to surrender to what was happening. Just
Mm.
that point you were making about the initial impulse is like, can I just get rid of all these symptoms and get my energy back and get back to work? That's the initial story that the mind is telling. I knew almost immediately that that wasn't available, that that wasn't on the cards.
Mm.
I was postponing things for the first few days, and then I thought, no, no, you just need to cancel everything. Postponing wasn't quite cutting it. So I
Yeah.
literally I did that. I just cancelled everything that I'd committed myself to do, everything that I'd agreed to. I let everything go, and there was this real feeling of just sinking deeper and deeper into the experience. And
Mm.
yeah, I mean, it was painful. It was horrible. I mean, I had a cough on like I've only ever had one like that in my life before, where I literally thought I was coughing up my guts, and it was horrible but tremendous at the same time. And what I noticed was my dream world became so active during this period,
Mm.
which was at the same time as my conscious ability to think and do anything was diminished. So it was almost like I needed that to happen just
Yeah.
to get my conscious mind on the back burner for a while. Just like, you don't need that. Just forget about that. Stop thinking about all that
Mm.
stuff you need to think you need to be busy with. And then as soon as I just let it all go, suddenly I was getting these amazing dreams, which were just rich with symbolism. Night after night, and sometimes three or four in the same night. I couldn't even write them down. There was so much. And normally my dream world is not like that. It's sporadic,
Mm.
and every now and again it breaks through and becomes more vivid. But I was just aware of like there's this whole inner process going on here, which I would do well to A, pay attention to, and B, listen into. Listen in to get a sense of what is this about for me, and it just felt like a whole kind of reorientation was taking place, which
Mm.
it wasn't coming from my conscious volition, from my own will or my own desire. It was more something that I just needed to notice and align myself with, and notice when I wasn't, when I was resisting it. I was
Mm.
like, no, not sure I want to go there. I was like, all right.
Yes. Mm. There's so much. There's a question I want to ask you. I'm just going to say this first that it just occurred to me how that, like what we might call ordinary consciousness, has been so valued as the kind of the one way to operate in this world. It's like it's a kind of wrestle, like how do we get back to that kind of like ordinary consciousness, that rationality, that ability to process. And it wasn't really until I went down the shamanic path and was invited, like very, like intentionally into trance. I realized, like, oh, this is the thing. And some of us in particular that are, naturally very open will recall, oh, there's actually lots of times in my life that I was kind of dropping into trance but then making that wrong and like trying to come back up to the ordinary consciousness. And I think that in itself, whether you call it a shamanic trance or, Jung style active imagination, but that just ability or that liminal space as we come out of sleep before we can like fully awake, valuing like that's a really necessary, is what I really see, necessary part of being fully human, is that we really allow ourselves to like dwell in those spaces,
Yeah,
to honor those spaces of non-order and consciousness.
absolutely right. And even something like what we call daydreaming, which it
Mm,
tends to have a kind of negative connotation in as much as we consider it a waste of time.
yes.
Typically, to me, it's in that category. And when I was
Mm,
sick, that's what I found myself doing. I was literally just sat with my head in my hands, looking out the window for days.
mm.
Like, when do we get to do that?
Mm. Oh, just so beautiful. So the question I wanted to ask you was, would you have a particular myth or archetype that for you has been one that's been especially powerful for you, helpful, has provided guidance, has provided, because that's what I always see. It's like the map that we're given when we again make contact, that call
Yeah,
into being intimate with a particular story or symbol. I'd love it if you have an example that you'd be willing to share
yeah,
with us.
yeah. I mean, there's many that I've been interested in at different times, and they've helped me in different ways. But the one that I think has been like the continuous thread all the way through is the Parsifal myth
Hmm.
from which is one of the Grail stories from the Arthurian legends. And that one is just such a rich tale, first of all. But I came to see that that really is that's me. I,
Mm.
I am that character in that story. I'm experiencing exactly what is described in that tale, even though it was written down in about 1200 AD and was probably an oral, you know, a story that was delivered orally for many, many, I don't know, who knows how many decades or hundreds of years before then. To me, it's a still a very much a living myth. Parsifal, as a young boy, stumbles on the Grail Castle, and which speaks to how very often how we fall into the mythic realm. We literally fall into it. We
Mm.
Campbell
Yeah.
had a saying which I really like: "Where you stumble, that's where the gold is." You know,
Mm.
but you don't know it because we got the blinkers on. So you've got to work to excavate the gold in order to realize that it's there. But often there is that kind of a stumbling. So it happens for Parsifal that he discovers the kingdom at a young age when he's still a boy, and he sees the Grail in all its magnificence, which is a very, very rare thing, which to me is the equivalent of what I experienced as an 8-year-old boy. I
Mm.
got a glimpse of something otherworldly, which I knew to be true. I knew it was a real experience, even though my mind was questioning it, very quickly. And I knew that it was showing me a kind of deeper level of the everyday level of perception. It was almost like I was seeing beyond what we can normally see and just getting a glimpse of the
Mm.
interconnectedness and the aliveness of everything. And then the shutters come down and back in ordinary life. Well, that's what happens to Parsifal. He gets kicked out of the castle because he's been well trained by his mother to do the right thing. And so he doesn't ask the question, the crucial question that needs to be asked, which is going to bring the whole kingdom back to life and everything. So he gets spat out basically. But of course, when you've had an experience like that, it stays with you, which it did for me.
Mm.
It's a blessing and a curse because you can't forget it. You've seen something wondrous, but how the hell do you get back there? And so, Parsifal, the rest of the story is his journey of how he gets back there. And basically, you have to earn the right. That's the difference
Mm.
between stumbling on it as a young boy versus revisiting the kingdom as a mature adult. You've got to become that mature adult, and that's all the trials and
Mm.
adventures that he goes through, on the way. And I still see myself very much in that story.
Mm. I love that so much. Such a beautiful example. There's an important aspect that I've really come to appreciate over the years is what you were calling there, that kind of maturation into adulthood. We often call it sovereignty, but really it's the same thing we're talking about. And that in a, I think when we kind of have this, most of us that are here listening to this have been raised in a Western worldview, and we can kind of clutch at ideas from, say, for example, Eastern philosophy and think, okay, so the work is for me to get rid of my ego. Where for most of us that have been raised in this culture is actually to, as you say, to individuate, to mature the ego, and for these things to be a conscious choosing.
Yeah.
And there's something, again, we can look to the myths, to the archetypes, and often this will be described as, king or queen archetype, and it isn't this kind of grandiose king or queen. It's very much like that inner sovereignty we're talking about here. But as you say, we often will be like just gifted these experiences for the first time or as a child. As an adult, that is something we consciously choose. And again, knowing that we're going to have the pull of our culture not to choose that. So
Yeah,
that maturation is so required.
very much so. Yeah, and it's not just the pull of the culture; it's the pull of your own desires and ideas
Yes.
of what
Mhm.
what you think you'd rather be doing instead of the.
Mm,
There's always that tussle, I find, and yet the deeper pull is towards the deeper mystery of life. And I
mm,
think that, to me, the older and the older we get, the more we do mature, the stronger that becomes. And traditional societies recognize that. There was a period in time when it was recognized that the what Jung called the first half of life was dedicated towards establishing your life in the
mm,
world, whether it's raising a family or a career or whatever form that takes. But then he talks about how this is the recognition of there's a second stage, which is actually in many ways the opposite to that. It's divesting yourself of all of that which you no longer need to be burdened by, and creating that space where you can, if necessary, go out in the forest, develop your practice, essentially, whatever that
mm.
happens to be. But you've got to make room for it, as you say, and you've got to be willing. You've got to be up for the adventure, and it requires it's not just an adventure in the sense of, this is a great thing we go and do once and have a good time. To me,
Mm.
the main feature of it is more like endurance. you, have got to develop the
Mm,
patience and the capacity to keep coming
mm,
back to something over and over and over again. I mean, rituals are boring, traditionally. There's an element to it where it just kind of wears you down, but you've got to keep showing up to it. And
mm.
and there's something happening below the surface that you can't yet see, but you got to trust that it's happening anyway.
Yes. There's so much synchronicity that's showing up in this conversation. Firstly, just happened to reread that. I think he said it in many different ways, but where Jung is talking about that kind of before and after 40 split, I happened to reread him talking directly about that just yesterday in one of the books I'm reading. But also, you brought to mind. I did a shamanic healing for someone last week, and I had a message from them this morning, just give me an update. And in it, they were talking about how the things that were shown in that healing that they were being kind of called into, they were recognizing how they're applying their usual way of being when it comes to, for example, um, a project at business or learning a particular skill. They were noticing how they were applying that same, like, I just need to get it done, to the things that the symbols that were being revealed in the healing.
Right.
And the wonderful thing is they notice this, which, as soon as we start to notice, we have an invitation into making a different choice. That was such a great example of, like, yeah, that just trying to get it done
Right.
isn't the right tool for this job.
Exactly. It's tempting. It's tempting to use that on everything, but you're right.
Mm,
That's not the appropriate mode, let's say.
mm. The you're sharing the myth Percival and how powerful it's been for you. As you were talking, I was kind of like having all different examples of my own come to mind of different ways that myths have really helped me to understand things differently and relate, like being different relationship to things. And one of the ones that's been really powerful for me in the last year or so is that of Chiron, the wounded healer. And there's something for me that Chiron represents, both in terms of, like, I found it really rich just in terms of symbolic, um, like where that is placed in someone's birth chart and the different aspects, like incredibly illuminating, like unbelievably so, like a gold mine every time I look at someone's chart and like see where Chiron is. But in terms of that invitation to value that story that we've journeyed with, that wound that we've sustained, that often most of us would spend a lifetime sort of trying to ignore or push down or try to fix. And the way the Chiron story, the as I'm sure you know, he was wounded in really a freak accident. Different tellings of it say different things, but a one version is he had actually collected this poison that he'd given to Hercules, and then it was this poison arrow just accidentally hit him in the leg. And because he's immortal, he can't die. He just has to be with this agony of this poison. And the story of him being this like incredibly wise healer, astrologer, teacher, and you're not able to heal this own wound. And the story goes on where different tellings of it, one he actually swaps places with Prometheus, who's then been kind of punished by the gods for stealing the fire. And eventually is kind of like does this deal where he's allowed to become mortal and die. And there's so many different aspects of that myth that I think for those of us, we may not call ourselves healers, we may call ourselves healers, we may not, but those of us that know that one way or another, we are here to help others walk the path that we're talking about here. That's path to self-knowledge, to wholeness, to recognize that. And this again, another Jung quote comes to mind. It's something like, only the wounded physician heals. And it's that knowing of our own vulnerability and the gold in our own story, in our own wounds, and to be humble with that, to be present to that, rather than think we're this glossy, invulnerable kind of like, I've got all the answers, you just need to do what I do. To
Mm.
be in that, like one foot in, yes, right now I'm in this role as a teacher or healer, but there's always this other foot in my own story, my own wound, my own myth.
Yeah.
And to be in that like journey with both as we're going. For me, Chiron was such a powerful invitation into, and again, there's a real humility for me that comes with that story, that as long as we live, that wound is always going to be present in some way,
Yeah.
but it's going to be this like oozing gold all the way through our life if we allow it to. There's just constant alchemy that is present when we can be humble enough to be in relationship to it.
Oh, I love that. I love oozing gold. Yeah, what a lovely expression. But it's amazing. That is a mythic theme which shows up in so many different stories. It's in the Achilles idea.
Mm,
What we call the Achilles heel. It's like
yes.
the thing
Hmm.
that you can't quite get over. That still bugs you. But
Mm,
also in the Parsifal tale, we have the Fisher King, who is the guardian of the Grail Castle, who has also suffered a wound in his thigh. Usually it's in his thigh, but it could also be said to be in his genital region. So it renders him somewhat impotent. And if the king is impotent, well,
mm,
then the whole kingdom is is infertile. Basically, nothing grows. It's a wasteland, and that the healing of the wound of that king cannot take place unless and until Parsifal himself completes his own journey of healing. There's like a counterpart,
mm,
one for the other.
mhm,
And to me, it just speaks, yeah, it speaks so deeply to that theme. And I see it so much in my own work, but also in my own life. Is as you say, there is that requirement to not get too carried away with what we think we're doing for others, or what's the outer form of the role that our life takes, but it's always in reference to what is it touching within us, what is it evoking
mm,
in us, what's required of us in order to be able to continue in that role and stay healthy, for one thing. I mean, that's one thing I discovered,
mm,
my own healing journey, was that I'm no use to anybody else if I if I'm totally sick myself, or I can't explore emotional depths with other people if I'm not willing to let myself feel those depths within myself. It's just a
mm.
counterpart, one of the other.
Yes, I love that so much. Something else just came to mind as you were talking about in that Percival tale, the fact there's that both the Fisher King and Percival, and then of course, a whole cast of characters. And I think we can very much cling to this sense of like this is who I am, this is how I am, and then this person out there is different, and often like they're different, wrong, bad. We're fine if
Yeah.
only they could be different. And I think there's something so um what's the word? It's like there's this real tangible, or more tangible than otherwise would be the case, it's not always tangible, sense of as we are called into that intimacy with a particular myth, to recognize that we have aspects of all those different people, all those different events, all these different symbols in a myth that represent aspects of self. And that, I think, is in itself such a powerful understanding for humans, in again, as we start to reclaim these parts of ourselves, to recognize, like, wow, they're held all in this one story. Like,
Mm.
where am I, the Fisher King? Or the story of Vasilisa came to mind, where it's got Baba Yaga. Like, no one wants to be Baba Yaga, but you start being that myth. It's like, where am I, this
Yeah.
witch in the hut that's on chicken
Yes.
feet? Like, where am I that?
Right.
What aspects have I got to reclaim that are actually really precious and powerful and needed, but have been, banished from the village because she's scary?
Yeah.
And that's something that we, again, I think, really struggle with, because we've been conditioned to be so kind of individualistic, and I'm this way, and it's safe for me to be this way because I know this functions. To be
Mm.
invited back into this, or yeah, I say back because it does feel like it is back into this way of looking, where it's like, oh, when am I that person? Which parts of me are that? What does this character have to show me about this in here?
Mm.
And like the way you just spoke about that, I was just like, yes, that's one of the parts of myths I most value.
Oh, me too. Yeah, and both Young and Campbell were quite emphatic on this point, that the one of the reasons that the Christian myth no longer speaks to people in a way that it did, in earlier times, is that in that in the biblical tradition, let's just call it that, good and evil have been separated,
Mm,
and we're supposed to emphasize the good and reject the bad. Let's just put it in those
yes.
simple terms.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the devil is cast out, as you said,
Mm,
and as far as we can, we keep away, as far away from that devil energy
mm,
as possible. And yet, what the mythical teaching shows us, is exactly as you say, is that what's required is a reconciliation of those opposing energies within oneself,
mm,
because they actually coexist within all of us. We've all got the devil in us in that sense. We've all got the
mm,
capability to do harm, to do things that we wouldn't do when we're in our right mind, but we're not always in our right mind.
mm,
Sometimes these other forces overtake us, and we find ourselves being Baba Yaga or whoever it happens to be. And this was what I think Jung discovered in alchemy, with his whole research into
mm,
alchemy, which was a huge thing in the latter part of his life, together with Marie-Louise von Franz. He came to the conclusion that alchemy really completed or compensated for the imbalance that was to be found in the Christian myth. It brought
mm,
the other sides to bear, because it has to do with the reconciliation of opposites, what they call the sacred marriage in the
mm,
alchemy tradition. It also has to do with the integration and recognition of the divine feminine in all its aspects, not just the Virgin Mary nice feminine, but also the dark feminine, which is part of the Baba Yaga energy, and
mm,
all of that, the Kali, the destroyer, the feminine as the devourer as well as the creator. But this whole question of good and evil, and recognizing that this is something that's playing out within each of us, I'd say that's a pressing concern in modern times. And it's
mm,
currently something that we're still very prone to project outside of ourselves. That's the enemy's out there. It's somebody else. Whereas what the Jungian and mythological perspective shows us is, no, that's a projection. It's to be found within all of us, and it's only when we reconcile it on the inside can we hope to do anything useful and productive in the outside, really.
yes. I just am realizing, like, oh, we're almost out of time, and this feels like a whole nother rich conversation. So maybe we need to do a part two to really dive into this. But I couldn't agree more. There's Another one of Jung's quotes comes to mind. It's something like those parts of us that we don't accept regress and
Yeah,
you were saying, like the more we do try to kind of like disassociate, repress these aspects of ourselves, and you said, like we then get taken over by the Baba Yaga. Absolutely. Where the invitation people like Jung are making to us is like, what if we can consciously journey and reclaim those parts of it, like really call them back from those places they have been banished.
yeah,
Um, which for me has been um really, I'd say, there's so many different aspects of work that I've done personally and done with others, but it's that in particular, that journeying into the darkness, into shadow, and reclaiming these parts of ourselves that have been deemed unwelcome,
yeah.
unacceptable. Um,
It's got to be
for
done, hasn't
me,
it?
like, yeah, and it's just like the most rewarding, most
Yeah,
beautiful of work. It's like, you're saying, it's probably the most pressing work that we're being asked to do culturally. I couldn't agree more. But the thing I think that if I could say anything to anyone, it's like, but it's also, yes, it can be painful. Yes, it can be hard, but it's also like the most
yes.
mind-blowingly magical and like beautiful and exciting work I've ever done as
Yeah,
well.
it's where
Like
the
if
gold
only
is.
we knew that. Yes, it really is like literally where the gold is.
Yeah, the gold
Um,
goes in the dark. That's what all of these stories
They're
teach.
all of them, all of
Yeah.
them. So we're up on time, but I think we definitely have got a part two in us to to continue this adventure together. For now, where can listeners find out more about you and your work, Ian?
My website is theinsightspace.com, as if it's one word. And yeah, that's the place that we find other recordings and written things as well. Yeah.
Excellent. And have you got anything coming up that you'd like listeners to know about? Any courses or anything like that?
Well, this weekend I'm going down to Devon. I've got a natural wisdom program, which is 2 days with my colleague Claire Brown. We spend a couple of days in a beautiful environment exploring these and other treasures together. And later in the year, I've got a retreat in Spain in September, which I call Walking the Path of Ease, which you could say is the counterpart to what we're talking about here. It's like the path of ease. Doesn't sound like that to me. But what what I what it looks like to me is the path of ease is just to do with getting in right relationship with yourself.
Hmm.
Another way of talking about the same thing, the same mysteries. So that's coming up later, and between now and then, who knows?
Mm. I love that you said that actually. I think that feels like a wonderful way to end this. It was occurring to me earlier when I can't remember which part of the conversation it was, but I've noticed the deeper we go in this direction, the more we recognize like, oh, I'm just constantly like I don't need to figure this out. I'm going to be shown what's next, what's next, what's next. If I just keep following what I'm
Yeah,
being called to, it will take care of itself.
that's it. That to me is what it's all about, is coming into alignment and realizing that there are these deeper forces holding and supporting us, carrying us, giving us little nudges, little all the way along. Yeah.
Yes, all the way. Oh, thank you so much, Ian. This has been such a delightful conversation. I'm looking forward to our part two.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, Lian. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.